We're back again here at allpointstv.com, and we're very glad to see you out there. And we are going to do a program that I wanted to do last week, but we got tied up with some of the things we want to talk about, and that at that time was a little bit more primary. But I did not want to skip over the fact that 60 years ago, as of last week, on the 22nd of this month, we had the assassination of the 35th president of the United States. And I did not want to have that pass without some comment. And so we're going to do this week what I really wanted to do last week. And I want to go into some detail about it because there are a lot of different things that have come out since, even since the last, we annualized the 22nd of November, but every year it seems like this new information comes out. And I want to do an update on what has been uncovered just recently and go into some of the things I've been studying over the years about this case. We can all remember, those of us who are old enough to be aware of the event. I know I was in college at the time, and I was in 1963, I was 2 years out of I'm dating myself here. I was 2 years out of high school. And, starry-eyed as most, I finished high school at 17, and I was starry-eyed like probably most teenagers during that time period, and was aghast at what was happening. Couldn't understand how a president could be assassinated in the 20th century. And I remember it so well when the news came across the airwaves that the president had been assassinated. I remember going to my English class, and I was waiting for the class to be dismissed, quite frankly, because I just knew the grief was such on the campus, and there was a lot of grief on that campus. We eventually had a program, a chapel. I went to a Presbyterian school, so I was at a religious institution, and during that week, we had a chapel meeting and memorial for the president, and it was very solemn. We were a very different country then. We were a more innocent country at that time, and I know I was stunned by it. Couldn't believe that a president could be assassinated in the 20th century of all places, given the modernity, quote unquote, as if not all periods that you're in are modern periods at that point in time. But I could not believe that you could have a person as popular as Kennedy seemed to have been, to have been taken away from us at such a young age, and a president at that time who had been identified with a lot of things that were probably a little bit more idealistic than the way we look at it now. Camelot and all of those things that they were saying. This president was his young wife, his 2 children. It was just an ideal looking situation, and us being starry-eyed as we were about the possibilities of the country, we had not gotten to the cynical point. We had not gotten as cynical as we are now, and we saw the country through a very different lens and then we were seeing it now. Today, there's a cynicism that you could not have even remotely thought about at that time, because there was so much promise, and we were coming out of the Eisenhower era, and it looked like the country was going into its maturity at this point. And vibrant president, a young first family, very attractive, and the endless possibilities. It seemed like the future of the country was being ensured, and everything was going according to some divine plan, it seemed. I thought that I would listen to people singing about God bless America, and it looked like God did have his hands on the country. I was one of those persons that had done a lot of study, and my eventually get a PhD degree in the area of the Constitution and the training that I had been getting starting in my really started in high school. And I think it really started in elementary school. Now I think about it, when I was one of the students in the classroom, and all the students had to do it, and that was to learn the Gettysburg Address. And that 5 minute speech by Abraham Lincoln, November the 19th, 1863, we all had to recite that. 4 score and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth for this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And you had to stand by your desk and say that. And that just excited me as a student. I mean, you listen to every student standing up by his desk and saying that, and over the time of 30 students repeating it, it just gave you a certain sense of connectedness to the country. And that was in Mrs. Pugh's class. And then I was, Miss Pugh was teaching, that was my 10th, was that 11th grade in high school. And then Mr. Vaughn's class was the culmination of all of my interest in that area, because he was a government teacher. And that started me in my journey in terms of being what I consider myself to be right now. I think I'm one of the premier scholars on the Constitution in the country. And I don't take a back seat to any of them as far as their training. I have training in it as well. And we're mutually trained, and I think I'm better trained than they are, because I see what they say. And for a long time, I couldn't understand why they were saying the things they were saying, but I had to understand the training was different. We're in the same field, but the training would be different, because when you're trained as a lawyer, there's a different training, and I didn't understand it at one time. I thought our training was pretty much, you get a degree in the Constitution. I was thinking all the training would be the same, but it's very different. And my training is specifically in the Constitution. And it started really, I used to say it started in Mr. Vaughn's class, but now that I really think about it, I go back to the 8th grade, when we had to, it's like a rite of passage at that point. All the students in my school, when you became an 8th grader, that was the recitation that you had as a rite of passage to the 9th grade. 9th grade was the beginning of the high school. In my case, it was Parker High School, but you could go to a number of different high schools, and some of them went to Holy Family, which was a Catholic school, and you had a choice of where you would go. I went to Parker, but it's like at the 9th grade, you are graduating from 8th grade with the Gettysburg Address, and that was like a ritual you had in our 8th grade. Every student learned that, and just certain things. We had a lot of rote training. And I really think there's a place for it now. I think you have to. You don't always understand what it is you're learning, but because it is recited, once you grow up into a great understanding of events, you can then begin to call upon it and then put it into a better context of what it was you were actually saying. I was just memorizing the words, and you have an outline in your mind about what that was about, but it's a skeletal understanding, and you put the finishing touches on it at a later time, but at least you had the foundation through the rote learning that went on, because a lot of our training was rote. You learn your timetables, and you learn to use your memory. And but that was very good for me because it helped me to cultivate a memory. I have a pretty good memory right now because of the training that we had at that time. But when I went to college, I had finished high school in 1961, and I stayed out one semester because I felt I was too young to go into college right out of high school, being 17 years old. So I stayed out a half year, and I went to Knoxville College in the second semester. I went there in February of '62, and I was 17, and I think I was I think I was the youngest person on the college campus. So in '62, I arrived in Tennessee, and I'm on the college campus at 17. And the following year, my sophomore year, I am stunned and couldn't believe the report that came across the airways in my dormitory that the president had been shot, and we were riveted to the television set trying to figure out how could that be and what had occurred in Dallas. And I can remember the news. I remember the voice almost of Walter Cronkite and the emotion that he had that day. And I know I was very emotional about it, and so were the students. Every student, not just part of the student body that felt this way. We weren't as dichotomized in the country as we are now, where some would have felt a certain way based upon their politics, and others would have felt a different way because of their politics. It was none of that. It was a grieving on that college campus that was unanimous among all the students. I remember we had a student there named Jolly Turner. I don't think he's with us anymore now, but he was quite a scholar. And I remember him saying something that I could not understand at that time. He was saying his analysis was that Johnson's guns were still smoking, and I couldn't understand what he was talking about because I'm not into that idea of this idea of it not being some nut out there that would pull this off. And that's as far as I was willing to take that because I could not even fathom anything that would might have been conspiratorial in a way, in shape or form, that would be something that involves anything other than outsiders and things of that sort. I have to say I was very starry-eyed. My training had been such that you're you just I guess I was just in in very conservative, a very conservative environment, both in sheltered in the community and things of that sort. We just simply there was just a lot of belief in the country, and we looked at I looked at John F. Kennedy as almost like as a rock star because of his seeming commitment to civil rights and things of that sort. I remember the situation in Birmingham, coming out of Birmingham, Alabama. And I remember the Bull Connor era, the dogs being put on children, things of that sort. And I saw the president and his brother, the attorney general, intervening seemingly on the side of the civil rights demonstrators. And that was something that riveted me to, again, to that administration. And it just was a very exciting, some traumatic things were taking place, very exciting time. I'm in my dormitory, and news comes across that the president had been I think the first report was that the president had been shot. They didn't say he had been assassinated. They said the president had been shot. And we immediately, you didn't have a lot of radios. You know, we were barely subsidizing our education at that point. We didn't have all these grants and everything, and you couldn't come out of your pocket to pay your expenses. Then that was a hard road for you to hold, and we had to accommodate each other. And there might have been one radio on that floor that I was on. I was on the let's see, I was on the first floor. They put the choir students on the first floor. That's where Mother Stevens was, who was the dormitory, the head of the dormitory. And the ones didn't like a lot of music blared and you were quiet and you were on the first floor. And I was on the first floor right next to the office almost. So when the news came across, we all huddled up in this one room on the first floor, went in there and listened to the radio about what was going on, trying to figure out. I'm stunned, trying to figure out what could have possibly happened in Dallas. And then later on, the news came across. I think it must have been about 1 o'clock now in the afternoon, and news came across that the president had died. My English class would have met that day, and it's riveted in my mind like it happened just yesterday. My English class met at 2 o'clock, and I went to the class, and I fully expected for the class to be dismissed. And when it was not dismissed, I thought it might have been because the instructor had not heard the news. But I began to really think that maybe there was not the same kind of feeling about it that we, the students, had. You had some. What I was able to detect a little something underneath. Couldn't quite figure it out, but it looked like there was some discordant views that we had, as opposed to the instructor. He didn't cancel the class, and we were different students at that time. You didn't question the instructor like you would do today. And so I sat there, and I was kind of split in terms of my psychology that day. I didn't feel as riveted to the class that day as I would have been normally, because I liked the class I was in. But I could not get past the fact that I'm sitting there stunned that we are having class and the president of the United States has been assassinated. Jolly Turner, who was in my poli-sci class, was saying some things about the assassination that I could not fathom that conversation at that point in time. My maturity level was not such to be able to accommodate the conversation he was talking about. It had to be a lone nut in my mind, and he was saying something very different, and I couldn't quite get into his conversation, but I could tell that he did not believe that it was all a matter of an outsider and a nut going off like many of us saw it. I would grow into a much deeper understanding of it, and to some extent become an expert in the area, because I was fascinated by the president and still am fascinated by Kennedy in a lot of ways. Although a lot of the mythical aspects of his administration have now fallen by the wayside, with a lot better understanding what really was going on. But it seemed that there were a lot of idealistic things that were happening. Thanks, John. A lot of idealistic things that were happening, and the starry-eyed country that we were. I think I knew I was starry-eyed. I was Eric Hoffa's The True Believer. Hoffa has a book out called The True Believer. I was a true believer. I believed in what I had been taught. I believed in the promise the American dream, all of those things. God bless America. That was uh, the song that we, grew up with. We put our hand over our heart and we sang the national anthem. It was just a we. I had a childhood that was. I think every child should have a childhood like that, where you believe in the future possibilities of the country, where you don't grow up as cynical as they're growing up now. We were very looking forward to the future. Thought it had an infinite promise and things of that sort. And it was earth shattering when news came across. And later on, I forget exactly what day of the week that was that the assassination had occurred. But later on that week, I do remember we had a chapel session, and it was very solemn and just there were no, we weren't in there boohooing, but we sat there very solemn uh, in the moment that the way we saw it, our president had been taken from us, and all the vibrancy of the family and the way we felt about that first family, it was just something that we had a great sense of loss, the grievance that we were feeling, the grief that we were feeling was real all throughout the campus. There was no one on that campus, I would say, that was, and there were 1,000 of us there. We were a small school. Nobody was not in mourning on that campus. Now later on, and this must have been I graduated from the undergrad in 1966. So I would have finished the undergrad in 3.5 years. And I come out at 20, I think it was 21 when I came out of the undergrad. And I was still a little too young to start my career, but I was still, I was really riveted to that time period, and I became fascinated by wanting to find out what happened. I began in around 1965 or so, graduated out of Knoxville in '66, but I began to read a number of books that began to change my political orientation, where I began to be a little bit more inquisitive about what really was going on in the country. What had I missed that a president could be assassinated in this country? What was really going on here, and what was that really about? And I began to read a lot of these books, and what was really more and more riveting, away from my conservative training that I had gotten, was I began to see things that were not necessarily within the consciousness of what I had learned and picked up in my early and formative years. I began to come out of that to become a little bit more askance of things and questioning more so than I was doing in my early teen years, because I never questioned anything. The authority was what the authority was, and what you were told is what you were told. You didn't question what you were told. You simply believed in the person that were over you, had your best interest at heart, and were telling you things that were designed to push you forward. I was raised in that kind of that kind of community, by the way, with people that were professionals. One thing about segregation, all the persons in the community lived in this, all of you lived in the same community. No matter what your educational level was, or your money, the amount of money that you earn. You all living in the same community. So all the winos in the community, all of the educated, the what you call the elite, the dentists, the doctors, the person that owned the cafes, and all of them. When you all in the same community, and so everywhere I was going with the adults at that time, I was around adults that all of them were telling me things I need to be doing with my time, and saw talent that they thought I had, and telling me stop playing so much football. Stop being out here, playing so much, and go home and get your workout and things of that sort. I kept hearing that, and they saw something that I hadn't seen, but by everybody telling me that I began to pick up on the energy, and I began to become a little bit more serious, and I began to study this Kennedy thing. After going off to college and coming back, and I began to look into it a little bit more deeply, and I became convicted by some of the books I was reading. Mark Lane's book comes to mind. I think Mark Lane's book is the first book I read where it jolted me. I couldn't believe that. I guess I couldn't believe that there was some other angles to it that did not meet the smell test. I mean, to me, this nut, and the case was closed because the Warren Commission report said it was closed, and that a single person did the firing in Dealey Plaza, and case was closed and all the rest. But then I began to see, well, if that were the case, then what are these concealed documents about? And that made me question it at the level of, why do you have to conceal anything once we have the person that did it, and that person had died 2 days after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and Jack Ruby had killed Lee Harvey Oswald. So then to have the concealed documents, that began to bother me, because if you have the person that did it and the person is now deceased, and you still are concealing the documents, I want to know more about why that would occur. I began to study this case. And after I had read almost all the books that were coming out at that time, Mark Lane's book comes out first. I think that might have been the first one, Rush to Judgment. And then that made me question. I think I began at that point to go back into the Warren Commission report, and I was reading it. The Warren Commission report is a mammoth book, but it's based on 17 volumes of documents that had been gathered to base the conclusion. But then what I wanted to know, and my beginning point was, I now want, after having read Mark Lane's book, I wanted to now find out who was on that commission, because I now want to see who those persons were. That's the beginning of my beginning to have some real questions here. And I know that every part of the government was in fact brought into it at some point. There was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Earl Warren.
Gerald Ford was part of the commission too, wasn't he?
Gerald Ford. There were 2 members of the House and 2 members of the Senate. Ford was one of the members in the House, and they had two senators, Russell and Al Inspector. They had a person from foreign relations, and also I would consider him to be a Wall Street person. That was John J. McCloy. They had Sherman Cooper, who were Hal Boggs from Louisiana was on the one of the 7 members on that committee. So I began to look at who had been appointed, and I was bothered at that point in time that the government was in fact appointing itself to look into what was becoming now a question about whether or not this thing was cut and dried as they said it was, because if it was, the documents would have been unsealed and we would know everything that had happened during that time period. It was no longer about trying to keep the lid on, because there might have been a group in Cuba that might have been involved in it. It might have had international implications of it to it, because they said Oswald did and Oswald was in fact dead. That made no sense. And you could now open the books up and let's see. When it was not open up, then I began to look at the details a little bit more differently. And I read a number of books that came out, and I began to see a number of photographs that bothered and pricked my interest as well. And what I began to see with the one that killed Oswald, Jack Rubenstein, shortened to Jack Ruby, I began to see that the mob this guy was part of the mob in Dallas and had connections to Chicago. And then I'm seeing that the election of John F. Kennedy had not been sacrosanct. This was a rude awakening for me, because I had not considered that what had occurred in the 19th century, where we had some bumps in the road in terms of those that were elected were not necessarily going into the office of the presidency, although they've been elected. I knew that from studying history it had occurred, but I thought that was in our past, and I did not think that could have happened in modern times. But when I began to look at this case a little bit more deeply, I began to see that John F. Kennedy had been installed in that office through some strings being pulled by his father, Joseph Kennedy, and some links they had to the underworld, the mafia in Chicago and elsewhere. And then I came across a transcript, and the transcript was in Edward Craneshaw's book. Edward Craneshaw has a very good book that should be read. It's called Khrushchev Remembers. And in either Craneshaw's book or in some other book that I read during that time period, it has a conversation of John F. Kennedy calling up John Dealey. And Dealey was one of the last members of the big machine in those large cities. Chicago was one, New York was one, the Tweed Ring comes to mind. And now I'm saying that something was not that had happened, a bump in the road in 1960, where Kennedy is in office because of something that happened in terms of quirks going on in Chicago, in Missouri, a couple of other places. And it's through that finessing that occurred. Now we have the president who had not really won legitimately and became the president of the United States. That shocked me. I knew it had happened in terms of the history, in terms of different things that happened in the past, because I knew it happened with Adams and Thomas Jefferson in 1800. And being a historian at that point, I was aware that John Quincy Adams had run for president in 1824 and had lost the election, but became president through a backdoor approach in terms of the finesse that went on in terms of having the popular vote overridden by the electoral vote, because the electoral vote elects presidents in this country, and the popular vote is an indirect vote. And I'm finding out more about that and seeing how that worked, and I'm now interested in that process, heading to go down that road to see how that would have happened. But John Quincy Adams becomes the sixth president of the United States and serves a single term from 1824, really would have gone in office 1825 to 1828, really would have gone out of office 1829, but I'm saying that the four-year term would have started in 1825 after being elected in 1824. So I'm thinking, I'm knowing that it happened, but I did not think that you would have those quirks going on at such a later time in the country's history. And it stunned me when I looked into the election of 1960 to see that there was more going on there than met the eye. John F. Kennedy was not supposed to have been the president, the 35th president of the United States. That was supposed to have been Richard Milhous Nixon, who was the vice president under Dwight David Eisenhower. Now, Eisenhower made a speech on the 17th of January of 1961, and it was very riveting in what was being said there, and very surprising to me that that speech was given, because it was a warning in the speech by Eisenhower. And he is actually telling the country about to look out for something that was developing at that point in time, which he mentioned it as the budging at that point military industrial complex. He made that allusion. Now we don't know what that was necessarily at that point.
But there was a Smedley Butler, that General Smedley, Wars of Iraq. He published that years after the First World War.
Mhm.
So there's already precursors of that. And Eisenhower had been a career military guy, a general.
Yeah.
So I think it is interesting too that he warned about it. The Democrats somehow transformed themselves to the Party of Peace. But anyway, during the Vietnam War, they're considered the war of peace, even though they're the ones initially got us into the war. So
yeah, John, I was becoming aware of you probably remember the name John Foster Dulles. Does that ring a bell?
yeah, he was under FDR's administration, right?
Yeah, he was, but he was the Secretary of State under Dwight Eisenhower, John Foster Dulles. I didn't know, but we'll later on find out the Dulles brothers were running almost like a coup inside the government. There was John Foster Dulles, Eisenhower's Secretary of State, but there was also Allen Dulles, who was the first director of the CIA under Harry S. Truman.
I knew they were somehow connected to the FDR administration, which was a horrible array of socialist and leftist-leaning people.
Yeah, it was. We were beginning to get away from some of the grounding points of the country at that point, and we were being delinked from the grandeur of the past, and there was a linkage going on in terms of some other things that were going on. And I think Eisenhower had picked up on that because the CIA was actually born in 1947 in that time period. So when Eisenhower came into office in 1953, elected two terms, elected in 52 and elected in 56, running against Adlai Stevenson both of those elections. It was a beginning point of the starry-eyed country that we were at that point. Some of the starry-eyed things that we had in the country, we just believed in our institutions at that point.
The thing is, right after the Second World War, I think we almost had to. Americans are forced because we allowed the government we allowed ourselves to be swept around by the government so long. We didn't want to believe the worst case scenario about our government.
Yeah, and the patriotism of World War II.
Yeah, the patriot. I mean, basically, we'd have been shocked and horrified to have this realization as to how coldly and cynical they were actually operating in.
Yeah, John, that's true, because after I saw a lot of people in my neighborhood that had limbs missing. They had fought. I was getting this as I began to mature more, but they had gone into the Korean War. They had fought in World War II. They had lost limbs and things of that sort. And I would later on read Kes Nelson's book, who wrote the book called "When the Affirmative Action Was White." Kes Nelson was a radical writer from Columbia University, and he made me understand why those persons in my neighborhood were in business, because they had gone in World War II and they were able to get around some of the segregationist blockage that was taking place in the South at that time, because they were able to get the GI Bill and get loans and open up businesses. So a lot of the people in my neighborhood that owned businesses had limbs missing, and I could now begin to understand that. But there was a lot of patriotism in our community, and we had a lot of persons that, we just believed in the promise of the country, and the country was it was one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. You said those words in elementary school every day. But now I'm reading in a genre that I would never have read in if the assassination had not occurred. And now my mindset is beginning to be altered somewhat by the fact that I'm coming in contact with information I would never have even tackled or thought about tackling prior to this traumatic event that had occurred. I want to find out what happened. How could, in 1963, a president can go into a city, a popular president, as I saw it, to go into a city and not come out alive? And how could that be? A nut can penetrate the security of the president of the United States. And I'm accepting that as possible at first, but now that I'm reading these books, I'm getting to see that maybe there's more to it than I first of all had meet the eye. My training, I was getting a lot of training outside the classroom, because I'm now reading. I'm in the library now, no longer just studying things that I had been studying before starting in high school. I'm studying a lot of things above my pay grade, but now I'm studying outside of the orbit of my understanding. I'm now studying in some very radical areas now, because the area I'm studying in now has me challenging the orthodoxy of how things are set up in the country. I'm no longer just reading about Madison and all of the people that were the pioneers of the country, the greatness of those individuals. They were great. George Washington, great. I'm understanding the greatness that was the foundation which this country was standing. But I'm now seeing some wheels coming off the cart, and some things are going on here that I cannot put into the context of that earlier training I had. Now I'm getting different training by the reading in this area. And I'm finding out that Kennedy had not really won the election in 1960. Nixon was supposed to have been the president, but he's not the president. And there's some things in the mix that were being planned under Eisenhower that would have been continued if Nixon had become the custodian of the country after Eisenhower, but it was stopped by Kennedy coming in. And now some things that were in the mix are not going forward because Kennedy is not part of the planning that is going on. And now he's putting a monkey wrench into it. And one of them was, in fact, what had been planned for this problem 90 miles off the coast of Florida, and that was with Fidel Castro that had come into power in 1959. Kennedy comes in and sees the plans and calls Allen Dulles in. Allen Dulles was the first director of the CIA, and calls him in and tells him that the plan that he had uncovered was not to go forward. Kennedy has brought his brother in there as the Attorney General, and so the Attorney General is over the Justice Department, which I now conceive that was a way of the brothers having each other's back in an administration where they were the outsiders at this point. They called Dulles in and tell Dulles that this what they discovered in the works would not be allowed because that could create tremendous problems.
I'm going to correct you. It was Medley Butler. That's the name of the Auror's Iraqi. I want to make sure I got the name right. But yeah, I mean, all that stuff is like they used war to, when war was going on, everybody was concentrating on, they're worried about their own family members being taken. They actually poured more people in to those government bureaucracies that they basically undid everything the Constitution is supposed to stop. Prevented.
Do you see that, John, as being at this point? Do you see where there's a major amount of the unraveling was going on during that time?
Oh yeah, because see, I have family members. My family was one side of my family was a Democrat, socialist leaning, FDR supporting people, whereas my dad's side of the family were more solidly Republicans, and the Republicans. They went along because they were at war. There was a lot of camaraderie and there was a lot of sense of patriotism and bipartisanship. But underneath it all, there was Republicans who were actually calling foul on the plays that was going on. Mm-hmm. They were concerned about the increasing, basically the making the government the total elites, and that's what FDR did. And that started under Woodrow Wilson.
Yeah.
And so basically it was just a continuation of that. So basically, it was just they were chipping away at the underpinnings. And it was the same radical group of people who got these people in positions, who had these people already trained by the universities on the East Coast. Mm-hmm. So my family saw that. My dad's family, I don't know how good and deaf they were, but they just saw this wasn't not allowed by the Constitution, but they saw on the periphery all this stuff, this activity. And they were kind of concerned. They're more concerned about it. They were screaming bloody murder about it.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, they didn't go along. My dad's family never had this. My dad's view about the wars and stuff were involved in and stuff like this. Basically, it was just money grubbing, techniques to get money for these corporations. Mm-hmm. That's what my dad's view was. It. I grew up with that. My dad was no counts a Democrat. He served in the Korean War. He was an Army Corps engineer, member of the combat engineer. So I mean, he went, but he knew that it was all farce. He knew all that crap was BS.
Yeah, you're making some points here. I was just not in that frame of thought until this critical event occurred that really in a way shattered my world. I was really starry-eyed. I look at it now, I was very starry-eyed. I did not even remember a thought that things could be other than almost the perfection that I had assigned to the country, because I believed in, and I still believe in what the framers put in place.
You believed in the blueprint, and that's what
that's right. I had the blueprint.
Yeah, but see, the thing is, it's like where the rubber meets the road. It's beyond that pale. That's beyond that whole thing. It's like, here's what we present to you. Here's what goes on behind the scenes, and that's what it was. I mean, the more you dealt in business, the business people had a better grasp on what's going on because they saw how business was done even during the war.
Yeah, that was beginning of another education for me. I was well trained in elementary and high school, and I was well trained in the undergraduate, but a lot of it was training in. It was a training into the system of things.
There's a lot going on right now. I mean, Ben Shapiro basically he tries to manipulate public opinion by saying, if you say anything to try to and you can express any concern for the Palestinian people,
Mm.
then you're against us. And it's like, no, it's well, Bush said either you're against us or you're with them. That's BS.
Yeah.
There's a middle ground.
Yeah.
And that's what they're trying to always. And if you try somebody else, look how arrogant and pissy they get when you challenge that narrative. I mean, both sides do that.
Yeah, if anyone had told me at that time that I would have the view of what occurred in Dallas that I have now, if they had told me I would have that view at that time period, I could not have believed it, not for a second, because my view today is 180 degree. If that's in a direct line away from where I was to where I am now, is 180 degree in a straight line away from the earlier view. The earlier view was that this nut had done that. My view today is that there was a tremendous amount of government involvement in the assassination of this president, and the cover-up would have occurred as a result of their involvement in it.
From my understanding, this is just totally from what I've just read and stuff. There's different groups within CIA, the NSA. There's groups that are some hardcore socialist, communist leaning. There's some people who are constitutionalist, and they're on the same organization. They're same agencies. They have the same banners and stuff, but they're working for different ends. So, I mean, it's like, sometimes it's good. Sometimes you got people turning on each other within the organizations.
Yes, I was the person that was saying that Joseph McCarthy must be out of his mind, accusing the government of having persons inside of the structure that were anti-American inside the government. Could not fathom that. That wasn't my training. I'm talking about James Madison. I'm talking about the grounding points of the country. I'm still my dad would tell me sometimes I was too idealistic. But that's how it Walter Cronkite. And that's the way it is. That's the way it was at that time.
Well, everybody thinks he was so unbiased, and they always point to him as being the stellar, journalist. He's the one that spoke out against the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
He said, and that's reporter's opinion. So he basically introduced himself into the narrative. He didn't just sit there and report the facts. He didn't do that. I mean, they always want to hold him out as some great pillar of journalistic quality, and he wasn't.
I found out that later about him, and there was a lot of veneer that there was a lot of masking that was going on. Walter Cronkite was a radical behind the sitting at the desk. A lot of persons wanted him to run for president because they felt he had such a honesty about him that they would like to have seen him run for the presidency, because we looked at a president as being like George Washington, the progenitor of the office, and look at the ones that came after him, and they were all great as well because they're standing in the same place that Washington stood, and just one after the other that were in fact standing in these shoes, and each one was great. That was the training we were getting. But now I'm reading away from that training. And I tell you another book that began to make me see that I had to look into this thing a little bit more deeply, and that was a book written by H.R. Haldeman, which was the book I read in the 1970s, called The Ends of Power. And this was written in the aftermath of the taking Richard Nixon out of the White House in 1970 and 1974 with the Watergate. And I had read Haldeman's book called The Ends of Power, where he was talking about something that I had not even thought about at that point. And that was he coined this term in my mind. He coined the term because I had not read it before, called the fourth estate. And he talked about it being what we now call fake news. But at that time, he's talking about the fourth estate, talking about the media, the news media. And I'm now seeing that the grounding of the Nixon administration, really the overthrow of the administration, was because of the media who ran. This was a coup d'etat.
See, I have issues with Nixon. You know, in retrospect, I was a kid when all that was going on,
Uh-huh.
but I even despite the fact you and I disagree on this, we've debated. I
Yeah.
did think he had a hand in the break-in, but but even with that, he was he was a lot less corrupt than the other politicians. And that's what my parents brought, my mom and my brother brought up to me. I said, "Yeah, we think he did probably order the break-in, but if you look at the other guys, they got away with it. The only fault is he wasn't adequate enough, covered his butt enough."
Yeah, John,
That's
I
what it
disagree on
was.
this point because I definitely understand John's point too, and I can see the tricky dick type of thing here, but I don't think it flies. And we have a certain respect for each other's points of view because I know John comes out of a studied understanding of things. He just doesn't fly off the hook. I do think that given the way the election was running and the way it played out, and all the indicators were they would play out this way, Nixon carried every state except one in the election of 1972 as the incumbent president, having won in 1968 and then won in a landslide. It won all of the electoral votes in 1972 except 18 electoral votes. Nixon got 520 electoral votes. And just the seismic level of the victory pours a lot of water into the idea that there was even a need to consider that McGovern had there was any reason to be concerned about McGovern winning the presidency. See, the reason why I don't agree with John on this point, but I do respect his view, is because I don't see it through the lens of George Moss in 1963. I'm coming away from that now with all the training I'd had and the studying I had done beyond that point. And I began to see here that there was another thing in place in terms of what had occurred and what was happening behind the scenes into what Eisenhower had said on the 17th of January 1961. There's another happenstance taking place. I was now seeing a government inside the government and a shadow government that was operating in the country. I began to look at that more carefully and seeing that there was this upfront type of visibility, but there's also Lasky's book, The Invisible Government, something going on that was not so much fortuitous in the political landscape on television. There was something going on behind the scenes. I began to see that as a problem, and that was something that was being guided from a more shadowy place. They had nothing to do with the electoral politics, but something that was outside of the electoral order that was going on as well. And I think that's what brought, and I'm convinced that's what brought Nixon down.
I mean, I can see parallels between Nixon though and what they're trying to do to Trump.
Yeah.
They didn't get a chance. They tried to do it during his term in office. Now they're still trying to get him after he's out of office.
Yes.
And so what it is the Democrats have always got a great way because they got press who are willing accomplices to whatever they wish to pull. They don't question it. If it was a Republican, they'd be under the scrutiny. They'd be under they're like a microbe under a microscope. But a Democrat could do glaring things that everybody can see on the steps of the White House or the Capitol, and they just ignore it. They'll just turn the camera away from it.
Yeah, I'm trying to study now. I like to, when I get into an area, I like to exhaust it before I leave it and go to something else. I'm trying to look at now at what point did the country begin to move into another, how do I want to put that? We moved from the pillars of the country at the grounding point being Madison and the 55 person in that room, all of those pioneers, Hamilton, all of that. At what point did the country begin to become unmoored from that circumstance into something that we're now dealing with that's away from that, almost totally from what was put in place here. I mean, we got books coming out now talking about. I'm talking about the book written by Thomas Woods, for example, Dr. Woods, who killed the Constitution.
You know, you ask when this happened. When you first started seeing political science classes offered in college,
Yeah,
that's where then now they become a professional class.
yeah,
Whereas the people before that had been people from the rank and file, just like the same thing with union leadership. It went off the rails when people who no longer had been workers in those industries become union representatives and the big wigs in the union. They were people who they never went through the same struggles. So once they got away from that, they got really radicalized.
yeah. The campus was different when I was there because we had that's another thing that happened, I think, as well. The people that were on those campuses at that point, at least where I was, and I'm at all of the major, universities here in this state, and I came out of Knoxville in Tennessee, and I was in a very conservative environment there. And I think the conservatives were running the institution at that point. They've all that whole that whole cadre of people that were teaching at the university at that point. All those professors are gone. A new cast came in where it began to become, over time, all those more conservative heads and of departments were changed over time, and we're bringing in a new scholarship, more radical group, and I see it. I see it everywhere I go now. This is not the place that my training was in a different time period, and it was very conservative. I'm conservative now, but I began to come in contact with some things here that rock, as they would say, rocked my world, because it shook the eye tooth out of my training, which was more starry-eyed, because I was trained into the ideas of what the framers were trying to do. I was singularly looking at that. But then I'm knocked off that course, and I'm looking at, I'm reading a lot of books that had nothing to do with that. Now I'm reading about the assassination of a president. I'm looking at all the nuances of what occurred there. I see Johnson having benefited from it, and what would have happened if he had not become president. He might have been going to jail because of things that they had on him. I'm seeing presidents now being set down and run out of office. I'm seeing in Nixon's case where the way they got Nixon out of office was simply put it on the front page of the newspaper for 2 years and drive the narrative that this man was a crook. And I'm now seeing that we had greater things that happened in the past, and this was culminating in a man having stepped down for the first time and resigned from the presidency. And I'm saying that this man had won all the electoral votes and he's stepping down from the presidency. Some of this stuff it's just not percolating all of a sudden.
Remember, he was always mocked because he said, they won't have Richard Nixon to kick around anymore. He'd been in a political insider since, since the 40s, mid 40s, right? Maybe early 50s, because he was Eisenhower's, vice president. So he had dealt with a lot the insiders of DC. He knows what he was talking about. Now, to us, that just sounds like a whiny complaint, but he was probably really, truly fed up. But then he should have gone. I think he should have gotten maybe an ally in the press and say, look what these guys are doing behind our backs, behind these walls. That's what I would have done if I was Nixon.
They thought they got rid of Richard Nixon in 1962 after he had lost the presidency in 1960. He ran for the governor of California, and after he lost the election for the governorship, that's when he said, you won't have Richard Nixon to kick around again, but he wasn't finished at that point after all, because in 1968, the country was in so much turmoil around the Vietnam War that Nixon made a comeback and he won the presidency after all and became the 37th president of the United States. Johnson was 36. Richard Nixon came in behind Johnson, became the 37th president, and now he's back after having been sent off riding in the sunset prior to that by having the election taken from him in 1960 and then having lost and then lost again. You think his career was over, but he came back. And that was not cool to some people that's in power. Now, there's a lot of stuff going on here. And I'm still that starry-eyed person to an extent, but I'm also got one eye on some other things that are happening that don't make any sense to me. And I'm now reading about, I went back and began to read about Joseph McCarthy because I'm now interested in what that was about. And so I'm reading about that again. And I'm reading just a lot of different books that's shaking my world. Today, I have come to the understanding that Oswald did not do any shooting of anyone on that day. That's where I am with that now. Oswald did not kill John F. Kennedy. You could not have convinced me of that in 1963. But I've done too much studying in the aftermath of that. And I think I think it's conclusive that Lee Harvey Oswald was framed. Conclusive. The evidence is to me very clear. I think that running into that building as they did, this one within 90 seconds, there's an officer inside that building with his gun drawn, running up those stairs to the 6th floor. To me, that would not have been a problem in 1963. It's a big problem for me today. And the reason that's a problem is because what I see now is they're constantly going where Oswald was. The first shot that hits Kennedy, it doesn't come from the back. Well, the second shot. The first shot hits him in the back. He is shot in the back. There are many shots being fired from different positions in Dallas. That much is clear. The president been shot in the back, but the first shot behind that, coming behind that similar sign, the president been shot in the throat. And you see him doing this in the Zapruder film. I looked at film, slowed that film down, and watched that film over and over again, trying to time that shot. That's a throat shot. That shot comes over into that limousine from the front. And you can see the president being grabbing at his throat. But the reason why I think he's been before that is because once that shot hits in the throat, the president could not have said in that car what they heard him say, and that was, "I've been hit." Once that shot happens, it severed his vocal cords. So with the president saying, "I've been hit," that's prior to that shot. That shot is a shot in the president's back. The president been hit 4 times. That's a fact. Kennedy was hit 4 times. As I studied this case and began to look at it away from the training I'd gotten, I began to see there's more going on here, not intended by the framers, nothing to do with them. They did a great job in setting up the foundation, through which there are some strings still in place because of that. But then the other things, the alternative, I began to look at that as a network that was in place. And now we have to look at it through conspiratorial lens. And next week when I come, I want to show exactly how this was put in place and how this thing was in fact configured in Dallas. Because what we now know, and what I know absolutely, is that there was a conspiracy to kill this president, and Lee Harvey Oswald did not do it. I'm going to finish this up next week and I'm going to show you exactly what happened during this time period. I also read my article about it as well on Facebook. I'm writing about it as well. And I will tell you that what we are now uncovering is what really happened in Dallas. Stay tuned. Until next week, I want you to follow your dream. If you don't follow your dream, you'll never know what's on the other side of the rainbow.